us. We're thankful, dear God, for the gift of your Son, for death, burial, and resurrection. We're thankful that you love us so much. We're thankful, dear God, that you give us your word for study and guidance and direction. And we live in this free country that we can come together and meet as family, friends in your body. We come together to study your word and your will. As we study it this morning, dear God, may we place it into our hearts and it goes into our lives so that we might live to be the people that you need for us to be. We're thankful for Tony and for the other teachers as well. We'd ask your blessings upon them as they guide us and instruct us in this hour. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, if you will, go ahead and open your Bible to the book of Proverbs to chapter 30 and verse 32. I told you last week that we're getting very near the end of our study of the book of Proverbs. Probably today and then one more lesson, and we'll be completing the book of Proverbs, and from there we will be studying the book of Acts, and we'll begin that study in just a couple of weeks or so. And but today is our 70th lesson from the book of Proverbs. I did not anticipate it lasting that long, but I think that it has been, at least for me, very profitable and very beneficial as we have studied this book. We're going to begin with verse 32, and either Agur as the king or Agur as Solomon's pen name, if you will, said, "If you have been foolish in exalting yourself, or if you have devised evil, put your hand on your mouth." What do you mean, putting your hand on your mouth? Okay. Restrain yourself. Be quiet. The first part of this, I think, is very interesting. If you have been foolish, foolishness, as defined by Solomon, is when a man has not thought about the consequences of what he is saying or what he is doing. Well, he says, if you have been foolish in exalting yourself. So if I exalt myself, what kind of behavior is that? That's just plain old foolishness, isn't it? If I am doing something that is beneficial and that is good, do I need to have somebody, or do I need to exalt myself? It'll be self-evident. If I'm doing something good, people already know about it. If I have to tell somebody that I am good, then what I'm doing is actually, they may not know about it, may not believe it anyway. I think sometimes you have people say, "Now, I'm telling you the truth. I'm telling you the truth." What do you think about a person who constantly tells you, "I'm telling you the truth"? You better watch out when somebody says, "I'm telling you the truth, I'm telling you the truth." It's just like somebody said, they're trying to trade with you, and they say, "I'm not going to cheat you now, I'm not going to cheat you." You know what that tells me? Watch them twice, 3 times. Well, if you've been foolish and exalting yourself, but then he uses that conjunction, or if you have devised evil. Now, what would that mean? Scheming? Lying? Cheating? I guess what you're thinking about is here, you have done something that is not good. Let me use an illustration. Several years ago when Shane went to Freed-Hardeman, I told Shane about a number of the stunts that we pulled when I was a student there. You know, no student would ever pull any stunt or anything like that. But I told Shane, I said, if you do pull a stunt, don't tell anybody about it. And but he couldn't restrain himself. And so after he pulled a stunt, he had to let everybody know he did it. If you've been foolish in exalting yourself, or if you've devised evil, what should you do? Put your hand to your mouth. Don't tell it. These are two very bad behaviors. And he's saying is, you need to put your hand over your mouth. You need to stop that. And I will tell you, the devising of evil also involves a person talking about what he's planning on doing. Now, there's some parallel passages which I think are helpful here. You know, if you go back to chapter 17 and you look at verse 28, he said, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace, and when he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. Or the book of Job, chapter 21 and verse 5 says, look at me and be astonished. Put your hand over your mouth. In other words, don't say anything. And then in chapter 29 and verse 9 of Job, he said, the princes refrain from talking and put their hand over their mouth. So the idea here is these are things that you ought not to talk about. You shouldn't exalt yourself. You shouldn't be devising evil and discussing that and trying to promote it with someone else. Okay, let's take verse 33. For as the churning of milk produces butter, and the wringing of the nose produces blood, so the forcing of wrath produces strife. Now, how many of you have ever churned milk to bring about butter? Okay. Most of us have not, at least my age have not. Now, we've got an old churn at our house, but I'd say most of us haven't. Some of you have, and if you have, that's a wonderful experience, but, maybe I shouldn't use the word wonderful, but it's something that you know that it requires action in doing that. Well, then we all have this idea, what about the wringing of nose produces blood? And I tend to think about most of y'all don't have two boys. I had two boys. What do you think happens when you've got two boys? Okay, you have a little wrestling match going on all the time. But what ends up happening is somebody pretty soon brings about blood because of that. Well, he's using two things, which they well understood. But then he says, so the forcing of wrath produces strife. Now, what's the message of that? Cause and effect. Okay, you make trouble, you'll get trouble. What about forcing of wrath? What is forcing wrath? Anybody got an idea what forcing wrath would mean? What's that? Overthrowing it? That's the instigation of it. I think that's the good word there. You got somebody here who is trying to push something. Have you ever seen somebody who is spoiling for a fight? What do they do when they're spoiling for a fight? Okay, juice you up. They're pushing you. Well, if a person tries to force wrath, there's going to come strife out of it. It's going to come back to him. And there's several passages, again, that I think are helpful here. If you go back to Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 18, he says, a wrathful man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger allays contention. In other words, some people are trying to bring about the strife, and there's some people who are not. And then in chapter 17 and verse 14, the beginning of strife is like the releasing of water. Therefore, stop contention before a quarrel starts. Solomon has frequently talked about preventing problems. What is better to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me, or never do what it brings about, something that you have to say, I'm sorry? Think about what you're going to do before you do it. And I think in the book of Proverbs, that's been Solomon's primary point is strife and contention will arise, some of it, without intending to do so. But people who create strife, people who are fomenting the problems, you need to take care of them and stop the strife before it ever starts. Any questions or comments on these last two verses, because we're going to shift gears as we go to chapter 31. All right, let's go to chapter 31. First verse. The words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. Now, if you'll remember, I told you when we studied chapter 30 that I did not know if Agur was a king of his own or a wise man of his own, or if it was Solomon writing under another name. We do know that that does occur. What was Solomon's other name? Anybody? Jedediah. And Solomon had other names by which he was known. In this case, I do believe this is Solomon because he is referred to as what? The king. And so I don't have any doubt here in my mind, at least, that here Lemuel is referring to Solomon. Lemuel means belonging to God, and so, or dedicated to God. And so I think what he's saying here, here's the king who was dedicated to God, but here is what his mother taught him. Now, I want to pause on that for just a second. How important is your mother in teaching? Very important. What does your mother teach you? Right and wrong? Who is usually the first person to communicate values to the child? The mother. Why is it the mother? Where's father? He's working. And it's been said that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And when you look at some people in the Bible and the profound impact of their mother, you think about Timothy and think about the faith that was first in his grandmother, then his mother, and then is in him. And you go to 2 Timothy chapter 3, and he says, from a babe you have known the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise unto salvation. You've known this since you were just an infant. And, I think sometimes we don't appreciate enough these godly women who are teaching our children in these really, really small classes, because that's where they learn respect for the Bible. That's where they will learn this is God's Word. And it starts, and some of those great women are able to teach. And those of us who have been blessed with godly mothers, we ought to be truly thankful for that. And so as he starts out, he says, this is the utterance which his mother taught him. Now, let me point out to you that if you start studying the book of Proverbs as a whole, 14 times Solomon refers to his mother. And if you can go, for instance, to chapter 1 and verse 8, I'm not going to use all 14, but just a few of them here. He says, my son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother. In chapter 6 and verse 20, my son, keep your father's command, and do not forsake the law of your mother. Chapter 23 and verse 22, he said, listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. And then in one more, chapter 29 and verse 15, he said, the rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Now, what his mother is trying to do is to teach him some things that are important in life. Some things that you will face. And in fact, in this context, there are three things that are in Solomon's mind that are very, very important. First of all, in verses 1 through 7, is to avoid destructive behavior. Now, are there things in life that are very destructive to a person? That if you get involved in them, your life's not going to be what it ought to be? Yes. Then in verses 8 and 9, advocate the cause of the weak. Those who cannot advocate for themselves, you be the person who stands up and speaks up for them. You be the person who is able to intervene on their behalf. And then finally, in verses 10 through 31, is to acquire a virtuous wife. And who better to teach what kind of woman you want your child to marry than your mother? She knows what you need. Have you ever said, boy, they are a perfect pair for one another? She really is able to take and polish the rough edges off of that young man. Well, aren't we all thankful that we've been given godly wives for those of us who are men? Well, let's look at what he says here about this avoiding destructive behavior. And let's begin, first of all, with verse 2. And he says, excuse me just a second. Verse 2, what, my son? What, my son of my womb? And what, son of my vows? Now, I've read over that many times and just done exactly that, read over it. When you see the word what does that make you think of? I'm asking a question. Okay. Y'all see the significance of this? Yeah, I mean, here is, she's speaking to him and says, did I have you for a purpose? Do I really care about where you're going, about what's going to happen to you? Notice some significance here. Son of my womb, I gave birth to you. Now, some of you women had a very difficult time giving birth. There's always pain involved in that. What, my son of my womb? I gave you life. I brought you into this world. That's what's worthy thinking about. But then notice the next one, which is the part which really, I guess, is escaped my attention. The son of my vows. And in that sense, I want you to think with me about what is found in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 1. In fact, if you want to turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 1, let's just look at verse 11. You'll remember that Hannah, a very, very godly woman, was barren. And if you drop down to verse 11, it said, then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant, and remember me, and forget not your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. Here she is, she says, Lord, I want a child. Do you remember as she's praying this prayer to the Lord, what's happening? Is she speaking out loud? Is she standing up on a hillside? What's she doing? Her lips are moving, no sound coming out. Eli thought she's drunk, and that's not true. But she's praying a prayer, and she is vowing a vow to the Lord, saying, Lord, if you'll just give me a child, I'll give him back to you all the days of his life. I just want to bring a child into this world. Is bearing children a very important thing for women? Yes. I'm expecting you women to say yes. But it is here the child of a vow. In fact, plural. And what, my son of my vows? I think about Bathsheba. What happened to her firstborn child? It died. Why did the firstborn child die? Sin of David and Bathsheba. Now, Solomon comes along, and do you suppose that after losing her first son, she wanted another child? Wanted a male child? And certainly here, as you think about this, it really forces you to say, you are not an accident. You're not something that's just unimportant. I care about you. I brought you into this world. In fact, I wanted you here. Son of my vows, son of my womb, son of my vows. Well, that leads us into verse 3. Do not give your strength to women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. Give your strength to women. Do not ever think that Solomon thought women were not worthy or not important. In fact, if you start looking at what he says, Solomon frequently talks about he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains the favor of the Lord. So you have to realize that Solomon is not, and nor was his mother, talking about all women, but he is talking about a specific type of woman here. What type of woman is he talking about? What's that? Well, not a holy, but a ungodly woman here. You can just flip back in your Bible to chapter 5, look at verses 1 through 11. Or chapter 2, verses 16 through 19. Chapter 6, verses 20 through 35. Chapter 7, Solomon repeatedly talks about the strange woman. The woman who cannot stay at home. The woman who's out committing harlotry. He says, you don't need to get involved with strange women. You know, every godly mother would look at her son and say, now, son, there's some women out there you need to be aware of. They are there only for the purpose of taking advantage of you. Do young men take advantage of young women? Yes, they do. Are there some women who take advantage of young men? Yes, there are. And here's a godly mother saying, do not give your strength to women. Don't let them take you and use you. And you need to make sure that you're not giving in to the lust of the flesh. So do not give your strength to women. Why? Because it has the potential to destroy kings. Could Solomon figure that out? You remember what 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1 says about him? Love many strange women. He married all these women, and then what did they do to him when he married all these strange women? Turned his heart away from serving the Lord. And when they did, that destroyed his kingship, did it not? I mean, here was a man who had great potential, who had the most wisdom of any of the kings before or after him, and yet did not live in accordance with what he had been taught. Or consider other kings. You know, when I read 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 31, and it talks about King Ahab, and it talks about him going and marrying the daughter of the king of Sidon, whose name was Jezebel. And she turned him to worshiping the Baals. At the root of this is not gratifying your heart with the flesh. In Hosea 4 and verse 11, harlotry, wine, and new wine enslave the heart. Enslave. Can a person become addicted to this kind of behavior? Well, let me ask you a question. Is pornography addictive? It is. Is prostitution addictive? Yes, because these people get involved in it and they go over and over and over again. And he said, you do not give your strength to women. And I think it's important to notice here, he says, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. Is that the only way a person can stumble and fall? No. Things that are so addictive that you become a part of compulsory behavior. And he's warning against these lusts of the flesh. Can a person get to where they live for pleasure and they lose sight of their role as serving as a king? Yes. That's exactly the point, is the king has to look, this is not the people serving me, this is me as the king serving the people. And to get involved in the lust of the flesh is all about serving self rather than serving God. Well, verses 4 through 7, really, really important verses, because Solomon is going to say, my mother warned me against something else. Let's read verses 4 through 7. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. Give strength to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are of a bitter heart, are bitter of heart. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his misery no more. Now I want to go back and look at what he's saying here that his mother taught him. It is not for kings. It is not for kings. Is this really important? Yes, it's important. It's not for kings to drink wine. Now, what's Solomon talking about? You remember chapter 20 and verse 1? What does he say? Wine is a mocker, strong drink or broiler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Wine's a mocker, strong drink a broiler. You know, people who get involved in it are just certainly going to find themselves going astray. You can go to chapter 23, verses 29 through 35. And he talks about, do not look upon the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup. He said at the last, it bites like a serpent and it stings like an asp, a snake. He said, it has such a profound impact on you. You need to stay away from it. You need to go completely from it. Now, it is not for kings, nor for princes. Don't skip over that. It's not for kings, and it's also not for princes. What's he saying? To Rehoboam. But my mother taught me it's not for me to drink wine. And she said it's also important for your children not to drink wine. It's a generational thing. You teach your children to stay away from the alcohol. Stay away from all of the problems which it causes. Now, he says here, it is not for kings to drink wine or intoxicating drink. There's two different words, Hebrew words used here. The value of this is to understand that this is not just talking about wine, which is, for instance, in Isaiah, is still in the cluster. Our problem is when we use the word wine in our English language, what do we think about? We think about alcohol. We think of what you would buy at a liquor store. In the Bible, though, the word wine can have two different meanings. It can have the meaning of what we would call grape juice. And there's several instances. In fact, the Bible often speaks of new wine. If you talk about new wine, what would that be? It's not fermented, it's fresh. And I've heard people ask and say, well, how could they keep their wine without it fermenting? Well, there's several different ways that they did that. Number one was if you were growing up on a farm and you wanted milk, what did you do? You milked the cow. Well, if you have a vineyard and you want fresh wine, what do? Press the grapes. And they wanted fresh. How many of you want milk that's several days old? You want the fresh. Well, that's what they would do. But there's other ways they had. One's called sulfur fumigation. Most of them would boil it down to a syrup and reconstitute it and mix it again with water. There's several ways that it was preserved. But in this case, when you add in the intoxicating drink, you're talking about something that is capable of bringing about drunkenness. And what she is saying is it's not for kings, it's not for princes to drink this intoxicating drink. Not for anybody. Well, here is the justification. Here's the reason behind it. Lest they drink and forget the law. Now, first of all, before we go beyond that, to drink and forget the law. What do you mean forget? What does an intoxicated person, how do they respond to directions? You know, for instance, you've heard people say, don't drink and drive. They got to tell that to sober people. Why? Drunk person doesn't think they're drunk. And they think, oh, I can drive. They may can't stand up, but I can drive. People who are intoxicated do not even think about it. Their mind's not rationally processing information. If they were rational, they wouldn't drive. They wouldn't do all these things. They wouldn't get involved in fights and brawls. So he says, lest they drink and forget the law. And I will tell you, it certainly does away with inhibitions. You let a person become drunk, what kind of things will they do? Anything. You know, let them drink and they'll disrobe. People will do a lot of things that they would never think about doing if they were in their right mind.
Tony, I've noticed that they used to say on television, friends don't let friends drink and drive. Mm-hmm. It's been changed. Now they just say friends don't let friends drive drunk. Because they say, I can drink and drive as long as I don't get drunk.
So you mean this sip and savor they had a week ago that people shouldn't have got back in the car and driven after doing that? I thought somebody should be standing up there, one of the policemen, saying, okay, let's do a breathalyzer before you get in your car. That's an embarrassment to our city. Yeah, we'll have a policeman right after you drink doing a sobriety check before you get in your cars. That's amazing to me. But second of all, he uses again the conjunction here, and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. Now, I think that's something that's worthy of pausing for just a minute. When he starts talking about perverting justice, you know, you've got to know the law, but you also, as a king, have to be willing to do things for the benefit of those who are afflicted. And if you are intoxicated, what would you do? How would you act? Well, let me give you an illustration in the New Testament. Do you remember Herod gave a great banquet and Herodias came and danced in front of him? What was that feast or party like? Do you remember what he promised to give her after she danced? Half his kingdom. Her mother said, no, that's not what you asked for. Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Now, did Herod want to kill John? No, because all the people considered John was a prophet. Even though John had rebuked him and said, it's not lawful for you to have your brother Philip's wife. You see, here he is, he's already made a foolish promise. And what's he going to do? Here comes the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Justice to all of the afflicted. You see, when you get intoxicated, you will do things and say things that you ought not do and you ought not say. Intoxication is a bad thing for a person who's going to be a judge, and a king was a judge. Well, then what benefit does any of this have? Give strong drink to him who is perishing. What do you mean about that? Okay, that's one possible way of looking at it, and certainly a reasonable one. Okay, alcohol is a pain reliever. And it's just like opiates are today for many people. Who do we give strong pain medicine to? Terminally ill people. And the reason why we give it to them is to relieve excruciating pain. In other words, it has a medicinal use to it. Can you tell me somewhere that this was done in the Bible? Matthew chapter 27 and verse 34. And the parallel in the book of Mark. Jesus, remember he was on the cross? They gave him wine mixed with gall, and if you look at Mark's account, it also was mixed with myrrh. You put all three of those together, and they gave it to Jesus, and what did he do? He refused it. Now, why would he refuse it? He didn't want to be numb. He was suffering willingly for the sins of mankind. And rather than be inebriated, influenced by the alcohol content in that, Jesus refused it. I think there's a great lesson in the application of what he's just said. Now, generally, we do give pain medication to people that does numb the senses. But that's for people who are dying. That's people who are perishing. So does NyQuil. You turn on the back of a NyQuil bottle and look and see what it says. But there is a medicinal purpose of wine, and I don't think anybody would deny that was, that's a person that would be a legitimate use of it. Now, here's another challenge to this, though. He says, and wine to those who are bitter of heart. And I'm going to go ahead and take verse 7 with it. Let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his misery no more. Now, I think that's where you run into a little bit of a challenge. But I don't think that you could take this and say, okay, just somebody who's just having a tough time, they're broke, we'll just give them a bottle of wine or some liquor and just get them all drunk. That's the way you're going to solve your problem with poverty. Really? Is that the way you'd solve poverty for somebody? In fact, many of the people who are in poverty got there because of what? Because of their alcoholism. And so one of the points that one of the Hebrew scholars made was the word let him. In other words, if a person wants to destroy his life, you don't do it. If he's going to destroy his life, just let him destroy his life. I don't know that that's the proper interpretation of it. I do know this. I do know that Solomon has been adamantly opposed, as was his mother, for a person getting involved in drinking alcohol because of what it's going to do to you. It's going to destroy you. So any interpretation that you place on this can certainly, has to recognize what else has been said. I will point out to you there's one other passage. It's 1 Timothy 5, verse 13, or verse 23, where Paul tells Timothy to no longer drink water only, but drink a little wine for his stomach's sake and his often infirmity. So there is a medicinal use of it. but it's not for just intoxicating a person. Now, I've got just a few minutes. I want to finish our section here in verses 8 and 9. Open your mouth for the speechless, in the cause of all who are appointed to die. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. Now, notice I guess you'd say the connection here, mouth and speechless. Who are the speechless? No. Okay, the word dumb is for a person who can't speak. Okay, their voices are not heard. That's a good way to put it. I want you to open your mouth for the peoples whose voices are not heard. Are there people in our society whose voices are not heard? The poor, the needy, they're the ones who really need the help, and nobody's listening to them. And so he says, open your mouth for them. Speak up for them. He says, in the cause of all who are appointed to die. There are people who need you to speak up for them because they can't speak up for themselves, nor can other people not in a position to do that. You need to step up. You need to be the voice that advocates righteousness and justice and fairness. If somebody's being mistreated, Stanley? I do. Let me ask you, what category of people right now really needs us to speak up for them because they can't speak up for themselves at all? The unborn babies. Who is saying for them, don't kill me? You think about that. They have no voice at all. And, if the mother is willing to take their life, then who is going to speak up for them? Then he says again, open your mouth. Well, who? Judge righteously. Plead the cause of the poor and the needy. There's so many places where Solomon talked about that. If you go back to chapter 22 and you look at verses 22 and 23, he says, do not rob the poor because he is poor, nor oppress the afflicted at the gate. The Lord will please their cause and plunder those who plunder them. If you don't speak up for them, God's going to speak up for them. Or you go to chapter 23 and you look at verses 10 and 11, and he says, do not remove the ancient landmark, nor enter the fields of the fatherless. For their Redeemer is mighty, and he will plead their cause against you. He's talking about the orphans. Well, does God call upon us to do the same thing today? You remember what James 1 and verse 27? Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless, the orphans, in their afflictions, and the widows, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. God is expecting Christians today who profess that they are religious to actually live it. And trying to speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. Well, Lord willing, next class, the worthy woman of Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through verse 31.